The rain didn't let up for over an hour. Ron Milton was becoming impatient. A flaw in his nature that had given him an ulcer and a top-flight job in design consultancy. What Milton could get done for you couldn't be done quicker. He was the best, and he hated sloth in other people as much as in himself. Take this damn house, for instance. They promised it would be finished by mid-July, garden, landscape, driveway laid, everything, and here he was, 2 months after that date, looking at a house that was still far from habitable. Half the windows without glass, the front door missing, the garden an assault course, the driveway a mire. This was to be his castle, his retreat from a world that made him dyspeptic and rich, a haven away from the hassles of the city, where Maggie could grow roses and the children could breathe clean air. Except that it wasn't ready. Damn it, at this rate he wouldn't be in until next spring, another winter in London. The thought made his heart sink. Maggie joined him, sheltering him under a red umbrella. "Where are the kids?" he asked. She grimaced. "Back at the hotel, driving Mrs. Blatter crazy." Enid Blatter had borne their cavortings for half a dozen weekends through the summer. She'd had kids of her own, and she handled Debbie and Ian with aplomb, but there was a limit even to her fund of mirth and merriment. "We'd better get back to town." "No, please let's stay another day or two. We can go back on Sunday evening. I want us all to go to the Harvest Festival service on Sunday." Now it was Ron's turn to grimace. "Oh, hell. It's all part of village life, Ronnie. If we're going to live here, we have to become part of the community." He whined like a little boy when he was in this kind of mood. She knew him so well she could hear his next words before he said them. "I don't want to." "Well, we've no choice. We can go back tonight." "Ronnie, there's nothing we could do here. The kids are bored. You're miserable." Maggie had set her features in concrete. She wasn't going to budge an inch. He knew that face as well as she knew his whining. He studied the puddles that were forming in what might one day be their front garden, unable to imagine grass there, roses there. It all suddenly seemed impossible. "You go back to town if you like, Ronnie. Take the kids. I'll stay here. Train at home on Sunday night." Clever, he thought, to give him a get-out that's more unattractive than staying put. 2 days in town looking after the kids alone? No, thank you. "Okay, you win. We'll go to the Harvest bloody Festival." "Martyr." As long as I don't have to pray. Amelia Nicholson ran into the kitchen, her round face white, and collapsed in front of her mother. There was greasy vomit on her green plastic Macintosh and blood on her green plastic Wellingtons. Gwen yelled for Denny. Their little girl was shivering in her faint, her mouth chewing at a word or words that wouldn't come. "What is it?" Denny was thundering down the stairs. "For Christ's sake!" Amelia was vomiting again. Her face was practically blue. "What's wrong with her?" "She just came in. You better ring for an ambulance." Denny put his hand on her cheek. "She's in shock." "Ambulance! Denny!" Gwen was taking off the green Macintosh and loosening the child's blouse. Slowly, Denny stood up. Through the rain-laced window he could see into the yard. The barn door flapped open and closed in the wind. Somebody was inside. He glimpsed movement. "For Christ's sake, an ambulance!" Gwen said again. Denny wasn't listening. There was someone in his barn, on his property, and he had a strict ritual for trespassers. The barn door opened again, teasing. Yes, retreating into the dark. Interloper. He picked up the rifle beside the door, keeping his eyes on the yard as much as he could. Behind him, Gwen had left Amelia on the kitchen floor and was dialing for help. The girl was moaning now. She was going to be okay. Just some filthy trespasser scaring her, that's all. On his land. He opened the door and stepped into the yard. He was in his shirt sleeves and the wind was bitingly cold, but the rain had stopped. Underfoot, the ground glistened, and drips fell from every eave and portico, a fidgety percussion that accompanied him across the yard. The barn door swung listlessly ajar again, and this time stayed open. He could see nothing inside, half wondered if a trick of the light had... But no. He'd seen someone moving in here. The barn wasn't empty. Something, not the pony, was watching him even now. They'd see the rifle in his hands, and they'd sweat. Let 'em come into his place like that. Let them think he was going to blow their balls off. He covered the distance in a half-dozen confident strides and stepped into the barn. The pony's stomach was beneath his shoe, one of its legs to his right, the upper shank gnawed to the bone. Pools of thickening blood reflected the holes in the roof. The mutilation made him want to heave. "Oh, all right," he challenged the shadows. "Come out!" He raised his rifle. "You hear me, you bastard? Out, I said, or I'll blow you to kingdom come." He meant it too. At the far end of the barn, something stirred amongst the bales. "Now I've got the son of a bitch," thought Denny. The trespasser got up, all 9 feet of him, and stared at Denny. "Jesus!" And without warning it was coming at him, coming like a locomotive, smooth and efficient. He fired into it and the bullet struck its upper chest, but the wound hardly slowed it. Nicholson turned and ran. The stones of the yard were slippery beneath his shoes, and he had no turn of speed to outrun it. It was at his back in 2 beats, and on him in another. Gwen dropped the phone when she heard the shot. She raced to the window in time to see her sweet Denny eclipsed by a gargantuan form. It howled as it took him, and threw him up into the air like a sack of feathers. She watched helplessly as his body twisted at the apex of its journey, before plummeting back down to earth again. It hit the yard with a thud she felt in her every bone, and the giant was at his body like a shot, treading his loving face to muck. She screamed, trying to silence herself with her hand. Too late. The sound was out, and the giant was looking at her, straight at her, its malice piercing the window. Oh God, it had seen her, and now it was coming for her, loping across the yard, a naked engine, and grinning a promise at her as it came. Gwen snatched Amelia off the floor and hugged her close, pressing the girl's face against her neck. Maybe she wouldn't see. She mustn't see. The sound of its feet slapping on the wet yard got louder. Its shadow filled the kitchen. "Jesus, help me!" It was pressing at the window, its body so wide that it cancelled out the light. Its lewd, revolting face smeared on the watery pane. Then it was smashing through, ignoring the glass that bit into its flesh. It smelled child meat. It wanted child meat. It would have child meat. Its teeth were spilling into view, widening that smile into an obscene laugh. Ropes of saliva hung from its jaw as it clawed the air like a cat after a mouse in a cage. Pressing further and further in, each swipe closer to the morsel. Gwen flung open the door into the hall as the thing lost patience with snatching and began to demolish the window frame and clamber through. She locked the door after her while crockery smashed and wood splintered on the other side. Then she began to load all the hall furniture against it. Tables, chairs, coat stand, knowing even as she did it that it would be matchwood in 2 seconds flat. Amelia was kneeling on the hall floor where Gwen had set her down. Her face was a thankful blank. All right, that was all she could do. Now upstairs. She picked up her daughter, who was suddenly air-light, and took the stairs 2 at a time. Halfway up, the noise in the kitchen below stopped utterly. She suddenly had a reality crisis. On the landing where she stood, all was peace and calm. Dust gathered minutely on the window sills. Flowers wilted. All the infinitesimal domestic procedures went on as though nothing had happened. "Dreaming it," she said. "God, yes, dreaming it." She sat down on the bed Denny and she had slept in together for 8 years and tried to think straight. Some vile menstrual nightmare, that's what it was, some rape fantasy out of all control. She lay Amelia on the pink eider down. Denny hated pink, but suffered it for her sake, and stroked the girl's clammy forehead. Dreaming it. Then the room darkened, and she looked up, knowing what she'd see. It was there, the nightmare, all over the upper windows, its spidery arms spanning the width of the glass, clinging like an acrobat to the frame, its repellent teeth sheathing and unsheathing as it gawked at her terror. In one swooping movement she snatched Amelia up from the bed and dived towards the door. Behind her, glass shattered and a gust of cold air swept into the bedroom. It was coming. She ran across the landing to the top of the stairs, but it was after her in a heart's beat, ducking through the bedroom door, its mouth a tunnel. It whooped as it reached to steal the mute parcel in her arms, huge in the confined space of the building. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't outfight it. Its hands fixed on Amelia with insolent ease, and tugged. The child screamed as it took her, her fingernails raking 4 furrows across her mother's face as she left her arms. Gwen stumbled back, dizzied by the unthinkable sight in front of her, and lost balance at the top of the stairs. As she fell backwards, she saw Amelia's tear-stained face, dull stiff, being fed between those rows of teeth. Then her head hit the banister and her neck broke. She bounced down the last 6 steps, a corpse. The rainwater had drained away a little by early evening, but the artificial lake at the bottom of the dip still flooded the road to a depth of several inches. Serenely, it reflected the sky. Pretty, but inconvenient. Reverend Coote quietly reminded Declan Ewan to report the blocked drains to the county council. It was the 3rd time of asking, and Declan blushed at the request. Sorry, I'll... All right, no problem, Declan, but we really must get them cleared. A vacant look. A beat. A thought. Autumn fall always clogs them again, of course. Coote made a roughly cynical gesture, intending a sort of observation about how it really wouldn't make that much difference when or if the council cleared the drains. Then the thought disappeared. There were more pressing issues. For one, the Sunday sermon. For a second, the reason why he couldn't make much sense of sermon writing this evening. There was an unease in the air today that made every reassuring word he committed to paper curdle as he wrote it. Coote went to the window, back to Declan, and scratched his palms. They itched. Maybe an attack of eczema again. If he could only speak, find some words to shape his distress. Never in his 45 years had he felt so incapable of communication, and never in those years had it been so vital that he talk. Shall I go now? Declan asked. Coote shook his head. A moment longer, if you would. He turned to the verger. Declan Ewing was 29, though he had the face of a much older man. Bland, pale features, his hair receding prematurely. What will this egg face make of my revelation, thought Coote. He'll probably laugh. That's why I can't find the words, because I don't want to. I'm afraid of looking stupid. Here I am, a man of the cloth, dedicated to the Christian mysteries. For the first time in 40-odd years, I've had a real glimpse of something, a vision, maybe, and I'm scared of being laughed at. Stupid man, Coote. Stupid, stupid man. He took off his glasses. Declan's empty features became a blur. Now at least he didn't have to look at the smirking. Declan, this morning I had what I can only describe as a visitation. Declan said nothing, nor did the blur move. I don't quite know how to say this. Our vocabulary is impoverished when it comes to these sort of things. But frankly, I've never had such a direct, such an unequivocal manifestation of... Coote stopped. Did he mean God? God, he said, not sure that he did. Declan said nothing for a moment. Coote risked returning his glasses to their place. The egg hadn't cracked. Can you say what it was like? Declan asked, his equilibrium absolutely unspoiled. Coote shook his head. He'd been trying to find the words all day, but the phrases all seemed so predictable. What was it like? Declan insisted. Why didn't he understand that there were no words? I must try, thought Coote. I must. I was at the altar after morning prayer, he began, and I felt something going through me, like electricity almost. It made my hair stand on end, literally on end. Coote's hand was running through his short cropped hair as he remembered the sensation. The hair standing bolt upright like a field of grey ginger corn, and that buzzing at the temples, in his lungs, at his groin. It had actually given him a hard-on, not that he was going to be able to tell Declan that, but he stood there at the altar with an erection so powerful it was like discovering the joy of lust all over again. I can't claim that it was our Lord God, though he wanted to believe that his God was the Lord of the hard-on. I can't even claim it was Christian. Something happened today, I felt it. Declan's face was still impenetrable. Coote watched it for several seconds, impatient for its disdain. "Well?" he demanded. "Well, what?" "Nothing to say?" The egg frowned for a moment, a furrow in its shell. Then it said, "God help us." "What?" "I felt it too. Not quite as you describe, not quite an electric shock, but something." "Why God help us, Declan? Are you afraid of something?" He made no reply. "If you know something about these experiences that I don't, please tell me. I want to know, to understand. God, I have to understand." Declan pursed his lips. "Well," his eyes became more indecipherable than ever, and for the first time Coote caught a glimpse of a ghost behind Declan's eyes. Was it despair, perhaps? "There's a lot of history to this place, you know," he said. "History of things on this site." Coote knew Declan had been delving into Zeal's history. Harmless enough pastime, the past was the past. There had been a settlement here for centuries, stretches back well before Roman occupation. No one knows how long. There's probably always been a temple on this site. There's nothing odd about that. Coote offered up a smile, inviting Declan to reassure him. A part of him wanted to be told everything was well with his world, even if it was a lie. Declan's face darkened. He had no reassurance to give. "And there was a forest here. Huge. The wild woods." Was it still despair behind the eyes? Or was it nostalgia? "Not some tame little orchard. A forest you could lose a city in. Full of beasts." "Wolves, you mean? Bears?" Declan shook his head. "There were things that owned this land before Christ, before civilization. Most of them didn't survive the destruction of their natural habitat. Too primitive, I suppose. But strong. Not like us, not human. Something else altogether." "Well, so what?" "One of them survived as late as the 1400s. There's a carving of it being buried. It's on the altar." "On the altar?" "Underneath the cloth. I found it a while ago. I never thought much of it till today. Today I tried to touch it." He produced his fist and unclenched it. The flesh of his palm was blistered. Pus ran from the broken skin. "It doesn't hurt," he said. "In fact, it's quite numb. Serves me right, really. I should have known." Coote's first thought was that the man was lying. His second was that there was some logical explanation. His third was his father's dictum: "Logic is the last refuge of a coward." Declan was speaking again. This time he was seeping excitement. "They called it Rawhead." "What?" "The beast they buried. It's in the history books. Rawhead it was called because its head was huge and the colour of the moon, and raw, like meat." Declan couldn't stop himself now. He was beginning to smile. "It ate children," he said, and beamed like a baby about to receive its mother's tit.
It wasn't until early on the Saturday morning that the atrocity at the Nicholson farm was discovered. Mick Glossop had been driving up to London, and he'd taken the road that ran beside the farm. Don't know why, don't usually. Funny, really. And Nicholson's Frisian herd was kicking up a row at the gate, their udders distended. They'd clearly not been milked in 24 hours. Glossop had stopped his jeep on the road and got into the yard. The body of Denny Nicholson was already crawling with flies, though the sun had barely been up an hour. Inside the house, the only remains of Amelia Nicholson were shreds of a dress and a casually discarded foot. Gwen Nicholson's unmutilated body lay at the bottom of the stairs. There was no sign of a wound or any sexual interference with the corpse. By 9:30, Zeal was swarming with police, and the shock of the incident registered on every face in the street. Although there were conflicting reports as to the state of the bodies, there was no doubt of the brutality of the murders, especially the child, dismembered presumably, her body taken away by her killer for God knows what purpose. The murder squad set up a unit at The Tall Man, while house-to-house interviews were conducted throughout the village. Nothing came immediately to light. No strangers seen in the locality, no more suspicious behaviour from anyone than was normal for a poacher or a bent building merchant. It was Enid Blatter, she of the ample bust and the motherly manner, who mentioned that she hadn't seen Tom Garrow for over 24 hours. They found him where his killer had left him, the worse for a few hours of picking. Worms at his head and gulls at his legs. The flesh of his shins, where his trousers had slid out of his boots, was pecked to the bone. When he was dug up, families of refugee lice scurried from his ears. The atmosphere in the hotel that night was subdued. In the bar, Detective Sergeant Gissing, down from London to head the investigation, had found a willing ear in Ron Milton. He was glad to be conversing with a fellow Londoner, and Milton kept them both in scotch and water for the best part of 3 hours. 20 years in the force, Gissing kept repeating, and I've never seen anything like it. Which wasn't strictly true. There'd been that whore, or selected highlights thereof, he'd found in a suitcase at Euston's left luggage department a good decade ago. And the addict who'd taken it upon himself to hypnotise a polar bear at London Zoo. He'd been a sight for sore eyes when they dragged him out of the pool. He'd seen a good deal, had Stanley Gissing. But this... I've never seen anything like this, he insisted. Fair made me want to puke. Ron wasn't quite sure why he listened to Gissing. It was just something to while the night away. Ron, who'd been a radical in his younger days, never liked policemen much, and there was some quirky satisfaction to be had from getting this self-satisfied prat pissed out of his tiny skull. He's a fucking lunatic, Gissing said. You can take my word for it, we'll have him easy. A man like that, he's not in control. You see, it doesn't bother to cover his tracks, doesn't even care if he lives or dies. God knows, any man who tear a 7-year-old girl to shreds like that, he's on the verge of going bang. Seen him. Yeah? Oh yeah, I've seen him weep like children, blood all over him like they was just out of the abattoir. Tears on their faces, pathetic. So you'll have him? Like that, said Gissing, and snapped his fingers. He got to his feet a little unsteadily. Sure as God made little apples, we'll have him. He glanced at his watch, and then at the empty glass. Ron made no further offer of refills. Well, said Gissing, I must be getting back to town, put in my report. He swayed to the door, and left Milton to the bill. Rawhead watched Gissing's car crawl out of the village and along the North Road, the headlights making very little impression on the night. The noise of the engine made Rawhead nervous, though, as it over-revved up the hill past the Nicholson farm. It roared and coughed like no beast he had encountered before, and somehow the Homo sapiens had control of it. If the kingdom was to be taken back from the usurpers, sooner or later he would have to best one of these beasts. Rawhead swallowed his fear and prepared for the confrontation. The moon grew teeth.